Shalom, welcome to another episode of Inspiration from Zion. I'm Jonathan Feldstein, and I have the privilege of being your host, coming to you from the Judean Mountains here in Israel. I like to refer to it as the original Bible Belt. Inspiration from Zion is a program of the Genesis 1-2-3 Foundation, whose mission is to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel in ways that are new, unique, and meaningful. I pray that you will find this all of those. Through this program, we're excited to connect you to people and stories in and relating to Israel to give you a window to look through, experiencing aspects of life here that you might not otherwise know about. We want this to be interactive, so please be in touch with us at inspirationfromzion@gmail.com and send along any questions and any comments about any topic anytime. Or you can reach us at genesis123.co and follow and like Inspiration from Zion on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Stay tuned until the end, where as always, we're going to be sharing some exciting offers, and please feel free to share this with others who will also find it of interest. So today, I have to admit, by full disclosure, I am terribly excited for our guest, but I kind of stumbled into the significance of her joining us, and I'll tell you why. Ophir Dayan is a rock star. I didn't even think of it in terms of her age. I just wanted to bring in somebody who's a real, incredible, and inspiring pro-Israel activist. And only when she sent me her bio did I realize that she's as young as she is, because she has the presence of being someone who's so much older and more mature. And I didn't think of her age, and that wasn't a motivating factor, but I'm so glad today to have somebody from her generation, because it really is important that we hear these voices and we get information and inspiration from people who are her age and have the experiences and worldview that she does. Ophir Dayan was born and raised in Ma'ale Shomron, which is a small community in the Samaria region of Israel. She was an instructor, the head of a local branch, and full-time volunteer for the Beitar youth movement as she was growing up. In her military service, she served as an officer in field positions in the IDF spokesman's unit and was awarded by the IDF head of operations for her role during Operation Protective Edge. Ophir studied both for a master's and bachelor's degree in international relations at Columbia University, and we're going to speak about that a good bit today. At Columbia, she spearheaded the fight for Israel at one of what's known as the most anti-Israel universities in the whole US, as part of an organization called Students Supporting Israel. Ophir is also active today with Comeback, a non-governmental organization that assists formerly incarcerated people, and another wonderful organization, B'Yadeinu, to assert Jewish rights on the Temple Mount. And she's a frequent contributor in many Israeli newspapers, radio, and TV stations. Ophir, we met a few months ago at the Christian Media Summit. I saw you on stage. You were tremendously articulate and inspiring. And I'm just really glad to have you. Welcome to Inspiration from Zion.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so let's jump in. But before we talk about why you were famous and how you were drawn into doing what you've done and what you're doing, I always like to talk about with my guests about their family's Zionist background. Now, you were born here in Israel. That doesn't make you any less of a Zionist, but who in your family were the Zionist pioneers who came back, and where did they come from and why?
So my dad came to Israel from Argentina on the first flight of 1970. He was supposed to be the last flight of 1969, but he flew with El Al, and we know how they like to be on time. So it was the first Oleh of 1970 at the age of 15 with his parents. And my grandmother was born in Argentina, but my grandfather was born, it's actually a really interesting story. He was born in Europe during their flight from Europe to Argentina when they realized it's not a safe haven for Jews anymore. So they moved across Europe until they got to Argentina, and their three siblings, each of them born in a different country in Europe.
Wow.
During their flight. Actually, if I may take one more minute, I think it's an important story to demonstrate how how far the Jewish people have come in the last 75, 80 years is that my grandfather was actually, he crossed an international border for the first time in his life inside a potato sack. He, they needed to go across the border inside Europe, and he was so tiny that his mother was afraid he's going to cry. So they muffled his mouth and put him inside a potato sack, and crossed the border at night, opening the potato sack, anxious to find out if little Moshe had survived or not, because he was only a few months old. Luckily, he did survive, and they made their way to Argentina, where I have to admit, as a Jew, you have always a certain repulsion from the diaspora. But I have to say that my family loves Argentina for everything it gave my family. It gave it a safe haven when we needed it the most. But my grandparents were avid Zionists in Argentina, and they met in the Tzohar, in the revisionist movement in Argentina, and they got married. And in 1970, the entire family, my grandfather, my grandmother, and my dad, moved to Israel. His older brother moved a few years before. Both my father and my uncle were going through to Beitar in Argentina. I'm actually a fifth generation on both sides in Beitar, which is something I take huge pride of.
So for people who don't know, Beitar is a Zionist youth movement.
Indeed.
That's part of, I'm having a senior moment. See, I'm not as young as you. Jabotinsky began in the theology of, not theology, so ideology of Zev Jabotinsky.
Right. So the revisionist movement, Jabotinsky founded the movement in 1923, and it branched out to be a youth movement, and the Tzohar, which was like the political club for young adults, where my grandparents met, and then they made their way to Israel in 1970.
So let me ask you a question about, so I appreciate how you say what we call in Hebrew hakarat hatov, your appreciation for what Argentina did, and I certainly for my family in America, and we all have that, but ultimately this is our home. But Argentina, as much as it was an important refuge for you and your family and many other Jews, it was also a place that accepted a lot of Nazi war criminals in hiding. Did your family have any awareness or interaction with that when they were in Argentina?
So not that I know of, but something that I just realized a few years ago while watching the incredible TV show about Eli Cohen, is I realized that my dad lived in the same city as Adolf Eichmann and Eli Cohen at the same time. The three of them lived in the same city, which I think is incredible because it shows the story of the Jewish people. We fled Europe because of anti-Semitism, and in the end of the day, my dad found himself living under a military government in Argentina. 20 minutes walk for distance from Adolf Eichmann, one of the most notorious anti-Semites and murderers of all times, and Eli Cohen, a proud Jew who risked his life to save the Jewish state, which is incredible.
Yeah, there's
one of them. Yeah.
For those who don't know more about Eli Cohen, Eichmann is certainly more infamous and a more known name outside of Israel. Eli Cohen, for those who don't know, we're not going to go into the story now, was a spy for Israel and was tremendously successful. The original book, I encourage everyone to read it, is called Our Man in Damascus. And I think in the last 2 years, Netflix made a really good film. Not entirely accurate, but it tells a good story as well.
Right.
Amazing. Right. Okay, so your father's family came here in 1970, the first flight of 1970. And how about your mother's family?
My mom was born here. In Tel Aviv. Her mother and father were also born in Israel. Interestingly, my grandfather on my mother's side was born in Shimon HaTzadik. Maybe your followers know it. It's Sheikh Jarrah.
It's in just a Jewish neighborhood just north of the old city in Jerusalem.
right. And it came into, it was in the middle of a huge controversy in recent years
Yeah.
because of two major events: a land dispute, and B, a series of anti-Semitic attacks performed by Arabs against Jews. So my grandfather was born there in that neighborhood. For all those who are trying to say that Jews
Yeah.
never lived there and it's a completely Palestinian neighborhood, that's not true. My grandfather was born in that neighborhood. Yeah, and his family is originally from Hebron.
From Hebron. Okay.
Yeah,
And when did they leave? What, in 1929 after the
yeah, yeah.
the
After the
massacre
massacre,
there?
yeah,
Right. So
yeah.
people,
So
the
on
other
my mother's
historic
side, it's a really,
long-term Israeli family with Zionist roots,
right.
but it's important for people to know who don't have the history that in 1929 there was a massacre. 67, if I remember correctly, Jews
Yeah,
were massacred, and what's important about that, as horrific as it was, is that a lot of people today, we're going to get into a little bit about this, talk about the occupation, and Israel doesn't have a right to exist in occupying Palestinian Arabs. But 1929, of course, there was no Jewish state, and the occupation was that of the British. So a bit of false narrative, but that's probably a deeper conversation.
right. And one more point that I think is important to point out, that it shows that for all those who are saying that Jews are just settler colonials from Europe, that's not the truth. Jews lived in cities like Hebron since the time of the Bible.
Correct.
In Jerusalem, in Hebron, in Tiberias, in Sfat, they lived in those places. So it's not like we came out of nowhere and decided to conquer someone. This was our home since forever.
Right. And just adding to that, historically, it's worth underscoring that when we talk about coming back to Israel, it is coming back. Your grandparents came from Europe, and your father was born and raised in Argentina, and my father's parents came from Poland and came here and then went to America, and I came back. But ultimately, wherever we were in the diaspora, it was a diaspora. Jews are not indigenous
Indeed.
to any place in the world other than Israel. And now it's just the miraculous return. And we've got 75 incredible years of statehood, and Jews coming back to Israel for 100, close to 150 years now.
Indeed. I just want to say one sentence that I
Yeah.
heard from one of my activists at Columbia, a bright student, an American Jewish student, who once during an argument with an anti-Israel protester told him, the protester blamed us for being settler colonialists and being occupiers. And then my activist, who was part of my club, turned to him and said, how can you not realize that Israel is the only place on earth where Jews aren't occupiers? And that sentence is something that resonated with me over the years. I think that's the essence of it. This is the only place on earth we're not occupiers.
Correct. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So Ophir, let's fast forward. Your family's in Israel.
Right.
You're born in Samaria. You grew up in Samaria.
Yeah.
You didn't serve, you served in the army, but you didn't serve in a combat unit. Yet when you got to university, you found yourself literally in the trenches. You undertook, I like to unpack this a little bit, but you undertook the battle to present Israel in a good light, but you also had to deal with physical threats from Arab and pro-Arab students. I'm curious, well, I like to talk about a lot of the details, but before we even do, did you expect that?
No. Look, the reason I chose Columbia, it's the only school I applied to in the US. I was adamant to study here in Israel, in Hebrew. But my dad once said, he lived in New York at the time, and said, you know what, maybe you should come to school here. And I said, you know what, if I get into Columbia, fine. But for any other school, I'm not moving across the world. I'm not leaving my homeland. And the reason I said Columbia is not only because it's an Ivy League school and it's a very, very prestigious and academically, advanced, and I loved the academic side of it. But one of the main reasons I chose Columbia is because I knew that there is a very strong anti-Israel, anti-Semitic sentiment among the students and professors. And I thought that after almost 4 years as an officer in the IDF spokesperson unit, I could contribute to this fight over Israel's image there. And I have to admit, being post Protective Edge, post a true war where I had to influence public opinion about Israel's actions during a war, I said, nothing, everything is just would pale in comparison to what I've seen in a war. But I was wrong. I think it's a different kind of anti-Israel sentiment. It's a different kind of anti-Semitism, because the people I worked with during my military service were reporters. Sometimes they willingly falsified some narratives and presented facts in a manipulative way. But in the end of the day, they knew what's going on the ground. The issue at Columbia and other very liberal schools is that the students are not always aware of the details, to say the least, not even the basic details. And it's pure hatred for some of them. It's irrational. It's not because they want to serve a certain narrative, it's because they really think Israel is the devil. And when they're convinced that Israel is an apartheid state, and don't have any real, proof, just gut instinct, it's really hard to fight. And I have to say that something I did not expect coming to Columbia is how the professor thought and talked about Israel. I expected to battle students, not professors. And I found myself increasingly over the years at Columbia, engaging more and more with professors and their anti-Semitic behaviors and statements, and the administration. And the students actually, it was difficult, but it was only 50% of the war.
Sure. Okay. You know what? So I want to come to that. But first of all, let's just take a really quick break. We'll leave that as a cliffhanger and talk about your battle against Columbia students and the staff and administration. But we're going to come right back. Okay, Ophir. So you're now at Columbia. What years are we talking about?
So I was admitted to Columbia in the fall of 2017.
2017. Okay. And you were there for 4 years. So until 21 or 20? Okay. 5 years. What happened? You got there, you knew you were going to be a pro-Israel advocate. You didn't expect it was going to be as challenging as it was. What happened?
So I have to say that it was important for me to be a part of the pro-Israel movement. This is my, I didn't want to study in the diaspora without doing that. That was what I perceived as my service to Israel while I'm there. Before I came to Columbia, before I started school, I reached out to the local Hillel chapter at Columbia, asked to join, but eventually I did not join because I fundamentally disagreed with the way they perceive Israel. They hosted Breaking the Silence a few times and said they would do it again. For me, someone who hosts Breaking the Silence couldn't be considered a Zionist organization, and this is not something I wanted to be a part of. Luckily, a few weeks before I started attending Columbia, I got a message on Facebook from someone who over the years became my best friend. Her name is Dalia Zager. She's Israeli, who was born and raised in Lehavim in the Negev. And she also attended Columbia and was at the time the VP of Student Supporting Israel at Columbia. She asked me to join, and I did. It was one of the best decisions I ever made. I want to take a minute to just talk about what's unique about this organization, because I think it's something that a lot of pro-Israel activists can learn from. So first of all, Student Supporting Israel is not a Jewish organization, which might sound a bit weird, but it serves a purpose. First of all, if Zionism is a just cause, and it is, everyone should advocate for it, not just Jews. And I think it's a very important message where, I had 30% at least of my activists non-Jewish. And it sends a very strong message to the students and the professors we interact with that not only Jews support this cause. And that's first of all. But second of all, if Zionism, and as I said, it's just movement, but it's one of the only, if not the only movement who managed to liberate its own people after thousands of years of oppression, we have the moral obligation to involve other people in that story and inspire them. So that's the reason Students Supporting Israel is a non-Jewish movement, but we also are less traditional in the way we talk about Israel. And this is something that was very important to me. Today, you know, Hasbara became kind of a joke. People say Hasbara with an American accent because it's not an Israeli term anymore.
Hasbara is a kind word for propaganda, for explaining, for public relations.
Right, and the issue with how Israel does Hasbara those days, in my eyes, is that it focuses on all the wrong things. It focuses on the great things that we've done since we got to Israel, but it doesn't focus on why we're in Israel. It's true that, you know, we invented ways and drip irrigation, and those are great things. And it's true that we exported them to Africa and helped, you know, grow crops across deserts. That's very true, and it's amazing, and it's tikkun olam, and it's everything. But in the end of the day, that's not the reason we're here. We didn't come all this way, and we didn't wait 2,000 years just to invent drip irrigation. That's the reason we're here. And increasingly on college campuses, when they talk about apartheid and they talk about ethnic cleansing, you can spill, you know, truckloads of cherry tomatoes on an apartheid wall. It's not going to go away. And I'm going to say something pretty blunt, but it's like someone asking you why you're beating your wife, and you say, yeah, but how cute is my kid? You know, we're not answering the question. They're talking about apartheid, and we are talking about cherry tomatoes. Yeah. And we're not answering the question. And Students Supporting Israel does something very different. Twice a year, every semester, we have a huge event on campus called Hebrew Liberation Week, where we present the story of the Jewish people, their connection to the land of Israel, the different communities inside the Jewish people. We're talking all the time about the deep connection and how, you know, statehood is not just one feature of modern Zionism, but it's an inherent part of Judaism. And we do the best that we can to show that connection and to disprove these false narratives of Jews being from Europe or Jews being from wherever, just coming here in order to conquer because they just saw, you know, a fruitful land and wanted to take over it. And that's what I like the most about Students Supporting Israel, that we are actually addressing the question being asked and not sugarcoating other things that are irrelevant.
Very good. So that thank you for sharing that. But I want to come back to what happened on campus. But before I do, I have to make an observation. I always record this by video, so I have the privilege of seeing you. Others who are listening now don't get to see you. Your responses and the passion is evident. But something you just said struck me. You went to Columbia already thinking, how were you going to be serving Israel? And but you met students. Most students on American campuses, and I was once one, are not thinking of servicing anything. They're thinking their 4 years, their education, what are they going to get out of it, and how is that going to contribute to their career? And I think that just underscores or highlights a lot the point that I made in introducing you, your maturity. Now, of course, you finished the Army, you came to Columbia University much older than an average freshman student, but nonetheless, I just have to highlight that because I didn't want it to slip by. Let's talk about, so what happened? You're with Students Supporting Israel, you're addressing the real issues, but how did you become in the crosshairs, if you will, of this very substantial or substantial by way of influence anti-Israel, anti-Semitic movement?
So look, unfortunately, Dalia and I were the only Israeli students advocating for Israel at Columbia at the time. Israeli students who go to Columbia, usually it changed a bit after the last Operation Guardian of the Wall, so we can talk about it, but when I was there, the vast majority of Israeli students didn't want anything to do with it. They said we did our military service, if they did or they didn't, I don't know. But they came to Columbia in order to, as you said, advance their careers, to find a good Wall Street position and stay there and marry the most Americanized woman they can. And they didn't want to be involved in all this, mess of Israeli diaspora, Israeli relations. They just didn't want to do it. So when you have this newcomer who, and I can attest and say about myself that it's very opinionated and very loud and is Israeli and joining the fight for Israel, it draws attention. And my dad was then serving as a diplomat in New York, which also added to, the spotlight that I got by the anti-Israel movement, especially when we hosted him on a campus for a talk. We can talk about that, but that was, I think, a turning point for me because they actually distributed flyers bashing my dad, saying a lot of incorrect stuff. And that's when I always knew that, but that's when it became very personal for me, that I understood that you can't detach who I am from this fight. The reason that I do it is not because I'm protecting this distant land. It's because when they say Israel is a racist state, they're saying Ophir Dayan is a racist because being Israeli is such a huge part of who I am.
Yeah.
So when I got to Colombia, it became very personal for me. Living in Israel, you sometimes take it for granted. And at Colombia, it became really personal. And I experienced a lot of instances where I saw how people who had no knowledge of who I am, just knew that I'm Israeli, targeted me in all certain ways, screaming white supremacist at me in the hallways, calling me a baby killer when they hear me speak Hebrew on the phone.
But entirely unprovoked. People would just...
entirely unprovoked. They can tell you that my first semester, nobody knew who I am. It's before I even became, a pretty well-known figure at Columbia. It was my first semester, and I was walking with a friend in a building at Columbia, and he is an American student who served in the IDF as a lone soldier in the Haredi Kfir battalion. Okay. And we were walking and talking in Hebrew, and we might as well have been, just American Jewish students. Like nobody knew we're Israeli, and he's an American. And we were talking in Hebrew, and then this lady, this student started screaming at me, "You're a baby killer." And it was my first semester. I was really shocked. I thought I misheard her, and I approached her and said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Why do you kill Muslim babies?" And I just looked at her, and I honestly, with like a lot of naivety, I just said, "I don't think I ever met or touched a Muslim baby. I don't know what you're talking about." And she's like, "No, you're talking Hebrew. You like to kill Muslim babies." And it's like, lady, I don't know you. I don't know who you are. Just leave me alone. And what I realized at that moment is that how vulnerable I was at Columbia, because this happened in the entrance to the building with a Columbia security doorman sitting right there, hearing this entire exchange of whatever you want to call it. It's not even curses, it's just insanity. And they did nothing. And when I approached the doorman and I said, you are part of public safety, maybe you should report what just happened, he just looked at me so confused and said, "Yeah, but so what?"
You experienced an assault. You were assaulted.
Yeah, and that's when I understood it's routine. Yeah. We can talk about it more if you want, but I even experienced something closer to physical assault once, in which case public safety was also present and did nothing, and did not intervene. And I realized it's a routine that Jewish students and pro-Israel students are vulnerable and they're not being protected by Columbia. Which is sad because it's an institution that I love. And this is something that is very important for me to mention, is that everything I did at Columbia is not because I hate Columbia. I love Columbia. I think it's a great institution, and I think it has some really great professors, and the level of knowledge and academic learning it's incredible. And I want Jewish and pro-Israel students to be able to attend that institution and, live up to their potentials. But a lot of them can't do that when that's the case. And everything I did at Columbia is not because I dislike Columbia, it's because I love Columbia and I want to make it a better place and a more safe place for those who want to attend it, if they're pro-Israel or Jewish.
So I want to ask you a question and maybe extrapolate from Columbia. And it's a few years since you've been there, but not that long. And you're certainly much closer to it than I am. But recently, there have been across American campuses, Western campuses, any number of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. They're the same, but they're different. But typically attacking Jews and making, as you just suggested, uncomfortable for Jews either to be there or to be there in public and assert whether it's their nationalist or religious orientation. What's your sense of across the board the situation for Jewish students on campuses?
I think it's getting worse. And I think in certain campuses it is bad. First of all, the distinction it is really important to make. It's not every campus in the US. There are certain campuses that are great for Jewish students. Student Supporting Israel has more than 50 chapters across the US and Canada and South America and Europe. And in most of them, it's great. During my time in Columbia, my fellow activists at Texas A&M passed a super pro-Israel resolution in their student body, something that I could only dream of.
Wow.
And it's not every campus. Some campuses are great. I even had a colleague, an SSI in the University of Iowa, which is super random. I think he was the only Jew on campus, but he was treated fairly. It's only a handful of very, very extreme campuses, and some on the right, some on the left, but it's more of the extreme campuses, not the mainstream ones.
Okay.
And I think what's happening on campuses today, and it's a very, very dangerous trend in my opinion, is that the administration is seeing anti-Semitic attacks as political, while other attacks based on race are racist.
Right.
So, and they treat it as such. So, for example, when I was surrounded by 70 anti-Israel activists at Columbia and chanted and screamed and almost assaulted, what they said, you should put public safety on your speed dial. But when an African-American student was attacked, not physically, thank God, she was attacked verbally by a white supremacist student, he was made to leave Columbia a few weeks later, and she was supported, which I have no complaints. I think they did the right thing, but I think that should have been the case in my case as well. Of
course.
And I think there's some sort of confusion not seeing anti-Israel and anti-Semitic attacks as equivalent to anti-Black or anti-Asian attacks.
Yeah.
So the treatment of them is also very different, which I think is very, very scary for students.
You articulate that very, very well. Thank you. There was an article recently, I'm looking at it on my desk, I don't see the date, but somewhat recently, in the last month or so, entitled in the Wall Street Journal, Christian Colleges Can Be Good for Jews, advocating that Jewish students who are being accepted to America's top universities at a lower rate and are finding discrimination and forms of harassment and assault and discomfort for their safety on an increased basis. So this article suggests that Jewish students should attend Christian colleges. A, did you ever hear of such a thing? And B, what are your thoughts?
So it wasn't a trend when I was in college. It sounds like a long time ago. It was only a year ago.
Yeah, I suppose you're very mature.
Yeah, but I reject that in the strongest terms. I think that Jewish and pro-Israel students should be able to attend whichever college they want. If they want to attend a Christian college, that's great. If they want to attend a Buddhist college, that's also great. And if they want to attend an Ivy League university, that's also great. I think this notion of, blaming the victim is
Yes.
very, very dangerous. I think Jewish and pro-Israel students should be able to attend wherever college they want, and the administrations should protect them. We shouldn't be forced into certain colleges because we are mistreated in other colleges. I think it says a lot about those colleges where Jews don't feel safe. And I have to say that Colombia is doing a lot in recent years to change that environment. And I want to give, I don't know if you'll hear it, but my dean in undergrad, Lisa Rosenmatch, I think she plays a huge part of it. She's Jewish herself, an Orthodox Jewish dean. And she took it as her life mission to make Colombia safer for Jewish students. Okay. And I wish that every Ivy League university in the US had someone like Lisa, because she really took it as her life mission, and not only protecting Jewish students, but also advancing academic relationships between Colombia and Israeli institutions. Thanks to her, Colombia now has a dual degree program with Tel Aviv University. And thanks to her, Colombia is now opening a global center for research and humanities in Tel Aviv. And I think those initiatives are doing so much, not only for the relationship between the US and Israel, but also for the Jewish students themselves on campus. When Israel is normalized on college campuses, when more Columbia students come to the Global Center in Israel for a month or so, when they meet more Israelis who come on the dual degree program where they study in Tel Aviv for 2 years and then in Colombia for 2 years, they interact with Israelis. And I think the most important thing is just to make sure that other students see us as human. That's the number one, that's the starting point.
Well, that and what you were suggesting before, whether Jewish or Israeli specifically, that nobody should be denied that opportunity and the educational experience and the growth and networking that comes out of there.
And the free will to choose whatever they want.
Right. Excellent. Ophir, I want to take a break. I want to pick up on one more thing relating to being a student, and then I want to talk about more big picture Israel things. But first, we're going to take this quick break.
Perfect.
Okay. So, Ophir, I admire how much you admire and had a good experience at Columbia University. I can go back to my university. I went to Emory. We didn't have a particular problem. In fact, so much so that, albeit that it was in the 1980s, I kept hearing about the troubles that pro-Israel students were having on other campuses, and we didn't. So I thought I would make a proactive relationship with the head of the Islamic Student Association to preempt that. And I became friendly with this Syrian medical student, who I've always wondered where he is, albeit that we didn't see eye to eye on very much. Many of my experiences at college, the things that I remember the most were not things that I learned in the classroom. I'm curious, what's the most important lesson that you took away that's still with you today from that experience?
So it's a question I wonder, I pondered for so long after Columbia and during my school years. I have to say that it's going to sound a bit tacky, I'm aware of it. But I think the most important lesson that I learned about it is that every person can contribute to this fight for Israel's name, even if they're not like me. I know I'm very vocal. I know I like to be at the front lines. That's just who I am. But I met so many students who don't like the spotlight. They want to do for Israel, but they don't want to be exposed. They don't want to be targeted. Or they're just shy, and that's fine. And I think there is some kind of mentality in the Jewish communities and in Israel that, you have to be in the front lines and you have to be the fighter, the warrior, but you don't. There's so much to be done behind the scenes. So I'll give you an extreme example. I want to say one-off, but I'm pretty sure he was the best activist I ever had at Columbia, is a student from Bangladesh. Bangladesh does not recognize Israel.
Amazing.
Bangladesh, and full disclosure, he's one of my best friends today.
Okay.
And we were just talking a few minutes ago before we started recording. He's an incredible human being. But his country, unfortunately, does not recognize Israel. On his passport, it said, you can enter every country of the world except Israel, which is funny if they don't recognize us, but they rather name on their passport, but whatever, a whole different issue. But he could not be exposed as a pro-Israel student. He was deeply pro-Israel, but his family still lived in Bangladesh, and he would put them at risk if he was seen advocating for Israel. And he spent 4 years at Columbia advocating for Israel, being on the board of Students Supporting Israel without ever having this picture taken as a part of our club, without his best friends who are in the Islamic Student Association being even aware that he was part of Students Supporting Israel. And he did so much for Israel. He even visited Israel twice during
wow.
And he was never seen with us. And it's incredible. It just means that everyone has something to give to this struggle, to this fight, even if they don't want to be exposed, even if they're shy, even if they feel they don't know the facts.
Very nice.
And another thing I'm going to briefly say that I learned during my time at Columbia is the importance of knowledge. And I know it sounds, obvious, but it's not. A lot of American Jews who come to college campuses, they want to advocate for Israel. They want to do good things, but their knowledge of Israel is somehow limited. Everything they heard so far in the very Zionist communities they grew up in is that Israel is this unicorn land where everything is golden and flows with honey, and it's the most perfect place on earth, and it's kind of a Disneyland on earth. And they maybe went to Birthright, and what they learned in Birthright, which I think is an incredible initiative, but what they see there as a part of Birthright's mission is to connect them to Judaism. It's not to show them any complexity. So what they know is Masada, and they know of camels, and it's really, really great. But when they come to college campus and they're being told that Israel is an apartheid state to perform ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, they don't have the tools to combat that. Correct. Not externally, but not even for themselves. They can't explain themselves this dissonance between what they've heard at home and what they're hearing now. And I'm afraid that many of them go either, they just hide their Jewish pro-Israel identities because of that conflict, or they join anti-Israel movements.
Because they don't know any better, or it goes with their orientation,
or they just don't want this conflict. We have to remember that American students get to college campus when they're 18. One of the most important things to an 18-year-old is having friends, obviously. Yeah. And they don't want to be sidelined. They don't want to be, I had a friend at Columbia who was not allowed into the hip hop club because he was in Students Supporting Israel. They don't want to experience those things. The hip hop club.
The hip hop.
A Jewish Haredi person, I don't know if he would fit in the hip hop club anyways, but he was not allowed because he was a part of Students Supporting Israel, which is absurd. So I think what I learned at Columbia is how important it is education on a college campuses, way before they gave the college campuses. And I spoke at many, I think hundreds of synagogues and community centers across Northeastern America when I was there, because it was so important for me to meet those students before they get on college campus.
Yes.
So they know what to expect.
Very nice. Okay, so Ophir, I want to pivot a little bit. Our mission, Genesis 123 Foundation, is to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel. Most of our listeners to the Inspiration from Zion podcast are Christian. So we've seen a parallel trend, certainly in America, of both your peers, Jewish and Christian students, who have walked away from their support of Israel or don't understand their support of Israel. And in fact, 2 years, something that I'm particularly sensitive to, there were two years ago, there were 2 polls indicating a 50% drop in support of Israel among young Christians, people who are your peers. I know you said that about a third of the activists and students supporting Israel were non-Jews. Some, I'm sure, were Christian. But I'm curious, what would you say as an Israeli Jew to a Christian student coming into a campus that wouldn't necessarily be a Christian campus, and they're coming from a home and from a community and a church that's typically pro-Israel. But they also, like the Jewish students that you encountered, don't know the history, don't have depth of knowledge. They know their Bible. What would you say to give them encouragement when they're coming to a situation like that?
Okay, I think it's not something I did a lot at Columbia, because Columbia is not known for its huge support of Christian students as well. It's pretty a-religious, but look, I think an important thing to highlight is the common grounds and the common ideals that we share between Jews and Christians, and the importance of the Bible not only as a religious text, which obviously it is, but also as a history book. And it tells the story of these people who lived in that land, who are indigenous to that land. And I think this is something that is important. But I would also say, and I'm aware that is not possible because it's very, very expensive, but something that we try to do a lot is subsidize trips for Christian students to come to Israel, because I think when they see it with their own eyes, this is where it changes. Not just Christians, obviously, but I can tell you that one of my good friends, who was the president of the Military Veterans Club at Columbia, is a Catholic Christian from an Italian family. When he came to Israel and visited the Church of Annunciation in Nazareth, you could see how the understanding of the importance of this land just hit him at once. Yes. You could actually see that. Sure. And I think talking about this common ground that we share is super important. But I know that's not what you asked, but it's really important for me to say. I think a huge challenge that we do have is addressing students who are not Christian, who are not connected to their religious aspect. And I want to briefly talk about how we introduced Israel to them, because I think it's no less important, and it's increasingly becoming the issue on college campuses with secular students who are interested in human rights, who are interested in stuff like that, and they see Israel as an occupier, as an apartheid state. And the way I always presented Israel, and forgive me for giving you my elevator pitch of Israel, but this is
I invited you. Pitch away.
This is the 30 seconds I gave everyone about who is Israel. I think that's increasingly the narrative we should be using, and it's 100% true. I'm not making anything up. But let me tell you the story of the Jewish people. It's an indigenous people who were born, raised, and lived in this land. And 2,000 years ago, they were expelled by European colonialists from their land. And for this kind of 2,000 years, they were oppressed. They were murdered. They were, enslaved. Yes. And at the height of it, the worst of all, they were genocided. A true genocide was performed against them. But after 2,000 years, they still had the hope of coming back to their land. And after 2,000 years of all these horrible things and genocide, they managed to liberate themselves and come back to this land and re-establish a sovereign Jewish state in their homeland. And for me, I don't know any more progressive, more liberal cause than this cause. Of the people who can liberate themselves from oppression. And that's the story I think we should be telling college students, whether they're Christians or Muslims. But this is a story of empowerment that we can all relate to. And that's the story of the Jewish people, not drip irrigation and ways, which are great inventions, but they're not the story of the Jewish people. We came back to Israel, and that goes back a bit to the Christian part. We came back to Israel for the Temple Mount. We did not come to Israel after 2,000 years. We did not pray for 2,000 years for Israeli Center, okay? And I think that's something that is important to say, that it's not, Judea and Samaria are not an appendix. They're not something, that we can settle on. They are the heart and soul of Judaism. They're the cradle of Judaism. And you can reach a certain conclusion based on your political opinions if you should give up some of it for peace or not. And I disagree, but it's a legitimate opinion. But first of all, you need to understand how central it is to Judaism before you make that.
Excellent. So let's go to that. You grew up in Samaria. Not everybody in Judea and Samaria, but most of us are right of center. But it also means that we have a unique interaction with our Palestinian Arab neighbors more than most Israelis and
Right.
more than most people in the world understand. What's whether overlaying your political opinion or not, what's your view as to what's the future? How are we going to get along? Will there be peace? How do we make peace?
Okay, so I'm sorry, it's not going to be an optimistic take, but look, growing up in the Samaria, I think one of the most important things I learned is to respect Palestinians. They are not going anywhere as much as we're not going anywhere. And their ideological beliefs about the necessity of them controlling this land are not something we just, really just like say, oh, okay, so we'll give you money or we'll give you, a piece of land and you'll go away. No, they want it all just like us. And I think what I understood living here is that these are two competing national movements and they have competing interests that I unfortunately don't see being reconciled anytime soon. And I think a lot of my friends who are left of center, and I'm sorry for saying that, but they show a bit of disrespect to the Palestinians when they say, they could settle for less and, you can resolve it. No, they have their ideology as much as we have it. And you can't just, buy them out with a bit of money and a bit of land. No, it's a true ideology. It's not just, something that they were willing to forego for a bit of money. And I think that's a very problematic view of Palestinian Arabs that is consistent across, the Israeli left and the American and European left, where they think, oh, we can just take these two nations and divide a country between them. No, we don't want half of it. Each of us wants to live in the entirety of the land, which is a problem because you can't reconcile that. And that's what I learned living here. I also learned, the boundaries that they're different. You can't deny that. When I was a first grader, it was during the second Intifada. My school bus got bombed with Molotov cocktails, with rocks, almost on a weekly basis. And I understood that they don't have those boundaries of not harming children, which is something that we value. In terms of the future, look, I again, it's not going to be optimistic. I don't see this being resolved anytime soon, but I don't think that means it needs to be stagnant. I don't think we should just say, oh, we can't resolve it, so we should do nothing. I think there is increasingly today a concept of minimizing the conflict and not just resolving it. So since resolving it is not an option currently, because we do not have a partner, let's say that straight out. The Palestinian Authority is extremely weak. It barely controls Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian areas of Judea and Samaria, let alone Gaza, where it has no influence at all.
Correct.
So I think that minimizing the conflict and making sure people suffer the least is something we should be doing. I think there are certain restrictions on Palestinians that should be lifted. I think not all checkpoints are necessary. And I think we need to give them some sort of ability to control some of the things, obviously not security or issues like that, but and with education there's an issue as well, but things like, I don't know, electricity. Israel gains nothing from controlling their electricity because they don't pay their dues to the Israeli Electricity Authority, and we give them electricity for free, which you and I pay for. And we can tell them, okay, you want to be independent?
Yes.
Fine.
Right.
Generate your own electricity and pay for it. And I think that would benefit both sides, because if they want to be independent so much, they can say, oh, but we don't want to have the burden that comes with it.
Right. So
and
much
and
of
I
their,
think
go ahead.
yeah.
No, finish.
No, I'm just saying that I think that both letting them do more and take more of the burden, and minimizing their suffering. You can't deny that, being Palestinian is not a very tempting offer. Their living conditions are not good. But I dispute the fact that it's solely because of Israel.
Right. So that's the point I was going to say, is that this month they mark what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe of Israel's birth and very existence, which unfortunately for them means that that's their narrative, is that they have not done, if they want a state and independence, they haven't really done very much to build that up. And I don't think it was deliberate. I don't know why, but there was an article this week I read that about a decrease of unemployment among Palestinian Arabs, which I'm sure you'll agree with me is a good thing. But then I also noticed that almost a third, 30% of the Palestinian Arabs who are employed in Israel. Now, that's a great thing from my perspective, is that we can be interdependent, but it also means that they have yet to build up their own economic infrastructure to employ their own people in ways that can create benefits that will give them something positive to do and to look for.
Exactly. I think what made Israel such a successful endeavor in its past 75 years is that Israel had all the mechanisms for a state before it became a state.
Yeah, that's true.
We had political bodies. We knew who was going to manage which aspect of Jewish life in the Jewish state, and Palestinians don't currently have it. And I think they can't only blame Israel for that. It's been 75 years since Israel's independence, and they did very little. I think it is important to say that a lot of suffrage on the Palestinian side is caused by their own leaders. And I think not saying that is missing the truth. I mean, President Mahmoud Abbas is now, I think, on his 18th year of a 5-year term.
Correct.
And that's not something Israel is to blame for. They could have elections if they wanted to, but they just don't want to.
Right.
And they're living under a dictatorship, not because Israel forces them to live under a dictatorship, because that's what their own leaders chose. And blaming it on Israel is not only wrong, but it harms them, because blaming Israel means that they're not resolving the issue. They're not making their leaders go to elections. Correct. Because they deflect the blame and put it on us, where we have nothing. We can't force Mahmoud Abbas to go to elections, not that we want to, because it's not our role. And I think that it's and the government that they have is a huge contributor to what we're seeing as their misery. I think the need to preserve, for example, the refugee camps in order to get assistance from the international community and from different Arab states, they need to show how poor they are. And they
interesting.
And if you look, and I think it's fascinating, there's in a place where you can watch Nablus, Shechem from above, near Har Bracha, and you see the vast lands that they can build on, and this really, really, really neat high refugee camp, and you can't ignore the thought that they don't have to live this way. They can branch out and they can build homes that are not on top of each other, but they choose not to do that, because that way they would stop getting money for infrastructure and for donations and for humanitarian aid from the international community and from other Arab states. And I think it's a pity that they prefer this money over their citizens and
the
their
well-being of the Palestinian Arabs. Correct.
And for us as Israel, it's also very problematic, because when you live in certain conditions of misery in a refugee camp, you become radicalized, and it comes out on us.
Wow. Tremendous depth. Thank you. I'm so glad thought to invite you. What an incredible conversation. I do
I'm
want to
glad you
have you
invited me.
back. There are any number of
Let's do it.
subsequent conversations, but I have one last question. Just in the eventuality that I don't
Yeah.
talk to you for 10 years, what's Ophir Dayan going to be doing in 10 years from now?
Well, hopefully very influential in Israel. Israel is my life mission. It's a huge part of who I am, and I want to be influential. I don't know in what way, but I hope to be influential. I'm going to be extremely modest here. My dream since I was 2 years old is to be prime minister. I still hope that it's going to happen someday. Maybe not in 10 years. That's very soon. I'm going to be less than 40, but maybe someday. But I do want to do good for Israel, and I think it deserves people who do good for it, and we don't see that a lot in recent years, unfortunately, on either side of the political map.
Well, one of the questions I was going to ask you, but we ran out of time and I kind of contracted things, was what would you do if you're prime minister? So I'll wait. I'll put that on hold
for next time
or until that
the
happens.
Cliffhanger.
But I look forward to that because you have the depth,
Me
you have
too.
the commitment. I'm impressed. I'm inspired, as the name of the podcast is, and I hope other people are. Ophir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And to all of our listeners, as you know, if you've been following Inspiration from Zion for the last 2 years, you know I say kind of tongue-in-cheek, if you've stayed with us this long, you deserve a reward. We've always created this great incentive. We call it From Jonathan's Bookshelf. Each month we give away a special volume connected to Israel and the land and the Jewish people. And all we ask is that you do is go to the Inspiration from Zion social media and like and follow us. When you comment and share the link to this program, we're going to select one person at random to receive this month's special gift. We're always grateful that this podcast is sponsored by our friends at the Willow Run Greenhouse in Culpeper, Virginia. If you're ever in the area and want to stop in and thank them for helping make programs and conversations like this possible, I know they'll appreciate it. And special thanks as well to the Coyne family for their meaningful sponsorship. Inspiration from Zion and all of the Genesis 123 Foundation programs are made possible by donations. So please consider joining us to help continue the dialogue to build bridges. This episode, it's the first episode of May. We're on the verge of the 75th secular anniversary of the State of Israel. And so we are celebrating this episode in honor of the incredible achievements of Israel in the last 75 years and praying for many, many more. If you'd like to sponsor a future episode in honor or memory of a loved one or special occasion, please be in touch at inspirationfromzion@gmail.com. As always, we love to hear your comments as part of a dialogue and invite you to send any questions, especially questions about traditional Judaism for our Ask the Rabbi programs. Please share this with others who will also find it of interest, and continue to join us right here, where we bring you more meaningful conversations about unique topics relating to Israel that you won't hear anywhere else. Wherever you are in the world, I pray that you and your loved ones are all safe and healthy, and I send my blessings from right here in the Judean mountains. God bless you.